So I'm Emily Withnall. I'm the editor of El Palacio. El Palacio, for those of you who may not know, was founded in 1913, so it's a very old magazine. It's the magazine of the Department of Cultural Affairs. We also have a podcast called Encounter Culture that I host, and I mention that because this coming Wednesday there's going to be an episode coming out about the archaeological excavation that's happening at the Cañón de Carnoy land grant. And one of our contributors today is talking about a different excavation that's happening at Acoma. So there's a lot of tie-ins with the podcast and the magazine. So this is the panel reading for the winter issue of El Palacio. These are not all the contributors in the issue, but they're the ones I always have a challenge deciding who to invite because they're all incredible writers and artists who contribute to the magazine. But yeah, so today we're going to start out with a poem. And I also want to say thank you to Fusion for hosting us again. We hosted this event for the fall issue for the first time last time, and it's a beautiful space. We love being here. We had great attendance last time too, and also thank you to Page One Books, who's back there. They're selling books by our contributors, so please go check those out after. They're excellent, excellent books. And then we're also selling the magazine, the winter issue, back there. And you can subscribe online, which I highly recommend, because we have another great issue coming up in the spring. There's going to be a lot of poetry. There's going to be a profile of our new U.S. Poet Laureate, Arthur Z., and our new New Mexico Poet Laureate, Myrriah Gomez. So there's a lot of good stuff in that issue coming out too. Okay, so we're going to kick it off with Santana. Last time we did it in the fall, Levi Romero did this beautiful song. And so I thought that was a great way to open this panel reading. So I heard this poem at a reading in Santa Fe and asked Santana for it like immediately after the reading because I loved it so much, and then I published it. So you will hear it shortly. Santana Shorty is a writer and poet from New Mexico. She received her BA from Stanford University and MFA in creative writing from the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her writing has been published in New Mexico Magazine, El Palacio, and Water Bodies, Love Letters to the Most Abundant Substance on Earth. And I just want to say that book is for sale back there, and Laura Paskus edited it. She is working on her first novel. She is a member of the Navajo Nation and lives in Santa Fe.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Fusion, for hosting us in this beautiful space. This is a poem called Sun Series. It's inspired by one of my former students named Killian Crespine, and it begins with a quote from the book Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. Sunrise. Accept this offering, sunrise. Part 1. Sun setting. The end is full of waiting, of willful meandering, the kind that compels you to put too many candles of too many varieties into your cart despite your fear of fire. There is moxie in doing something you don't want to, in finding feral, in seeking an unachievable solace. At the windowsill, sitting at the battered and water-stained pane, you will notice your breath is too shallow to properly fog your view. Tea is tasteless. Coffee is too sharp for your tongue. The outdoors is calling you, but you cannot keep warm. And when you are looking for the cure, a cure, any cure, you will look back and be astonished by your own unwillingness to believe. Part 2. Sunlight. There is a clinking sound when I remove the worn hand-me-down plate from Mama. The reflective cast and orbital shine it sheds on your jawline is luminous. I stare. How its half-lit light creates a moon on your face, and I realize the galaxy is sitting at my kitchen table. Part 3. Sun Mountain. The miracle of living, of catching a prism in the eye to have the gift of blindness for only a few spark moments. The sun-felt sprawl of erosion and basalt rock. I am porous, am wilting under the fainting feeling that is being grounded and roofed for too long. I have been carrying rocks from the Pacific Ocean in my many-threaded pockets, and here they tell me they are home. When I walk up, cactus needles lean forward to catch my hand, and I do not pull away. My foot slips on the mountain's worn grain, and I meet the earth more than once. My water is in the car, but I know I will not be thirsty when I reach the top. How is it that with each step I push down, I am lifted up? Can I call this flight? Part 4. Sun Risen. I am gathering the parts. At the 5th post of the newly sown barbed wire fence, in the backfield next to the oldest peach tree on the property, there is one. In the back wheel well of my mother's silver Prius, which she uses to transport groceries and alfalfa, goats and grandchildren, there is another. The 3rd was harder to find. It was nestled like a newborn kitten, blinking and wild beneath the patchwork flagstone porch of my new home. And last was the sacred 4th. It came to me, unbidden, unwanted at the time. It sat both squat and tall, a sentry in the pillowy ashes of my father's wood stove, the morning after the coldest night of the year. I keep them in a lacquered honey-toned box, which I dust monthly. They hum, vibrating a holy frequency that I can only hear in the pink morning before my dreams have left me, or the night it snowed 4 inches after spring threatened her pollen-clad backhand for a week, surprising us, as she always does, to no one's surprise. The whales are singing so loud, we hear them from our desert perch. White light is making us sick and weepy. Forests groan, brown and fibrous under the weight of smoke and gases that were meant to stay below. I do not want to write another poem about the earth's fetid ending, but all the parts have come to me at a time we cannot call coincidence. Don't you dare. I disrespectfully decline the demise. I refuse fear in all its opulent and chaotic forms, for I have medicine embedded in the printed patterns of my palms, I have feathers braided through the pines of my hair, and I have the parts, in all their almighty and wayward forms, ready to protect us when needed. But first, we must accept this offering. Thank you.
Thank you, Santana. Okay, we're going to start the readings, and just so you know, they're just reading excerpts of their articles. I highly recommend that you get the issue and read them in full because they're all excellent, excellent articles. We're going to start off with Rica Maestas. And just to give a tiny bit of context, and maybe you can talk a little bit more too, but there's a city-wide exhibition in Santa Fe right now called Once Within a Time that was organized by Site Santa Fe and in collaboration with a lot of other museums and institutions in Santa Fe. And so there's tons to see. I highly recommend it. I think it's up for just another month or a little less. No, is it?
I think this is the last weekend.
Oh, last weekend? Oh no. Well, in any case, there's stuff to read about it online if you're interested, and this article is wonderful. You don't have to have seen the exhibition to appreciate the history that Rika's article goes into, so I highly recommend checking it out. So Rica Maestas is a socially engaged artist and writer from Albuquerque whose creative and cultural work elevates lived wisdom and prioritizes mutuality. Welcome, Rica.
Hi. Please forgive me in advance. I'm used to more like extemporaneous fare, so I'm going to try to read in a way that's entertaining. We'll see how that goes. To give you context, the part of the exhibition that I am writing about is two artists in the Palace of the Governors. And the selection from the article that I will read is the very tail end of one artist, and then the meat of the other artist. The artist that I will be spending the most time on is Daisy Quesada Ureña, and I selected that part because she is a local artist, and I hope you all have an opportunity to see some of her work. She's represented by Pie Projects in Santa Fe. She'll be at a biennial in Sydney, I believe. She's awesome. Hope you enjoy. Taken as a whole, Weston's exhibition asserts that glass is not neutral or natural in our built environment, but in fact carries far-reaching ideological, practical, and social implications. Situating her work alongside Edouard Glissant's essay For Opacity, during our interview, Weston echoed the idea that the Western demand for perpetual transparency is a colonial strategy that advances white supremacy. In other words, if participation in society requires our constant comprehensibility, we must not only efface our individual complexity to remain consumable to others, but also submit to the omnipresent surveillance and policing that maintains our flattening en masse. In symbolic dissent, the persistent ambiguity and personified positioning of Weston's work challenges viewers' assumptions about glass as a medium within the gallery and beyond. And more broadly, the work asks us to consider opacity and the discomfort of not knowing as a viable alternative to oppression inherent in compulsory transparency. To borrow from Weston's musings during our interview, what happens when we sit with our not knowingness? How might it be generative? The ambivalent role of transparency within historical constructions is significant in Quesada Ureña's exhibition, Past Between Present as well, evident in the content of the works on view and in the placement within the Palace of the Governors. One full wall of the gallery is punctuated by gleaming windows looking out onto the bustling plaza. On opposing walls, cutouts behind plexiglass reveal the New Mexico History Museum's earthen structure beneath its white cube veneer. The simultaneous visibility of the original architecture, the smooth contemporary renovation, and the adjacent plaza lends the exhibition a sense of permeability, where portals between past and present, inside and out, remain painfully open. Past Between Present engages directly with this architectural liminality by not only replicating the museological use of plexiglass in the installation, but also displaying the artist's curated artworks and artifacts between shoring posts. More often seen in construction or archaeological sites, the shoring posts in Quesada Ureña's installation elevate some objects over others, demonstrate the historical, social, and political forces they withstand, and minimize deleterious effects on the historical site. Where art installations often require invasive, damaging interventions to the spaces they occupy, like drilling into a wall or ceiling. Quesada Ureña's works hover using pressure alone, like bones healing beneath a plaster cast. As a viewer navigates this array of shoring posts and floating vitrines, it becomes clear that the vertical force barely begins to contain the power of the items born between. Ghostly porcelain garments float alongside highly charged historical artifacts, including, but not limited to, guns belonging to New Mexican Confederate soldiers and glittering soil from the controversial excavation of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. However, the quietest of these historic pieces may be the most explosive, shards of a bell likely used during the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Like shrapnel lodged beneath the skin, these bell fragments rest directly on the centuries-old adobe bricks behind the museum's plexiglass barrier, rather than within one of the artist's vitrines. While the striking commentary might easily be overlooked by visitors unaware of the local history, or those who simply miss the ceramic splinters in the Palace of the Governor's side, this subtle choice speaks to a lingering social rift that has strained Santa Fe for centuries. As the only successful native uprising against a colonizing power in North America, the Pueblo Revolt expelled Spanish settlers from New Mexico and beyond, following decades of extortion, enslavement, and abuse of indigenous peoples. Puebloan communities then occupied the Palace of the Governors for several decades, during which some say the tradition of vending under the portal began. This practice remains visible through the windows of the exhibition, though so too does the Soldiers' Monument stone panel belying quote-unquote savage Indians, and the annual celebration of Spanish forces retaking the palace. This tension between colonizer and colonized has been on display on the plaza for centuries, but Quesada Ureña's choice to slip historic Picaris bell fragments under the palace's plexiglass protection quietly honors the centuries of indigenous resistance to social, economic, and environmental oppression in New Mexico. Opposite this powerful installation, Pass Between Present highlights one of the most pressing instances of ongoing colonial injustice impacting the land of enchantment: nuclear extraction on native lands. One of the artist's porcelain sculptures takes the petrified form of a garment selected by a curandera to protect local journalist Alicia Inés Guzman during her investigative tour of Los Alamos National Laboratories. Adjacent to this haunting piece is a retablo depicting Our Lady of Light and a ceramic child's blouse filled with blue corn seed. Viewed optimistically, these companion pieces might suggest divine guidance, leading a next generation toward nonviolence and ethical land use. However, the process of creating the artist's sculptural works might suggest a more ominous read. After being soaked in slip, the sometimes found, sometimes gifted reference garments are incinerated in the kiln, leaving disembodied traces of their obliterated forms, not unlike the eerie shadows left by Hiroshima and Nagasaki residents vaporized in atomic warfare. A similarly apocalyptic interpretation lurks within the retablo depicting Our Lady of Light. While her visage could be viewed as a savior to Catholic viewers, she might also refer to the eponymous Spanish colonial missions that sprawled over present-day Texas. More broadly, the invocation of Catholic iconography might point to the role of the Church in the colonial occupation of the Americas and the genocide of indigenous peoples, an era historian Gerald Horne has posited as an apocalypse. This interpretation may be bolstered by the resemblance between folk depictions of Our Lady of Light and Our Lady of the Apocalypse, a precursor to La Virgen Guadalupe, both of whom hold a male infant before a celestial backdrop of attending angels. Analyzed thus, the light in question may just as easily refer to the possibility of nuclear annihilation as it does to a guiding light. That's the section. I promise it ends on a slightly more optimistic note, but I'll leave it to the next authors.
Thank you, Rica. The whole article is worth reading. Definitely check that out. Okay, so our next reader is Myrriah Gomez, and I just want to say, so I grew up in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and then I went to Highlands for undergrad, and Myrriah and I were in classes, in English classes together at Highlands in the early 2000s. So I didn't even remember that till we met again, like recently. But this article is about Las Vegas and about the Chicano movement in Las Vegas in the 70s, which I never learned about growing up in Las Vegas. And more specifically about the Chicana element and the parts of that history that are even less known. So I'm really excited about this article, and obviously it has like a special place in my heart since I grew up in Las Vegas. But yeah, anyway, Myrriah will tell you more. But Myrriah Gomez is an associate professor in the Honors College at the University of New Mexico, and the author of Nuclear Nuevo Mexico, Colonialism and the Effects of the Nuclear Industrial Complex on Nuevo Mexicanos. And her book is for sale back there as well by page 1.
Thank you, Emily. Ooh, yeah, this is a shorty problem. Thanks, Emily. I just want to start by thanking you for asking me to do this article and then inviting me to share the event with these amazing women. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todas. Gracias por venir. I'm Myrriah Gomez. Before I start reading, I want to acknowledge one person and then I'll acknowledge some other people later. But Dr. Ray Hernandez Duran, just raise your hand real quick, Ray, is one of the co-curators of this exhibition that I'm going to be talking about. So thank you, Ray. And I'll talk more about the curators a little bit later. The title of this article is Art and Activism at Highlands University, Photographs from the Voces del Pueblo exhibition, and I'm going to be skipping around. If you are walking on the New Mexico Highlands University campus in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and you find yourself on the south side of Hippie Hill, and you know where to look, you can see the phrase Viva la Raza scratched into the sidewalk. You can see it best during golden hour when the sun starts to set across the plains of Nuestra Señora de los Dolores de Las Vegas Grandes. And if you stand outside of Professor Eric Romero's office, you can see a poster for the first meeting of the National Caucus of Chicano Social Scientists in 1973, the organization that would later become the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies, NACS. As a 20-year-old Chicanita, I sought out that history when I was a student at Highlands. I sought it out in classes like Chicano Literature with Professor Daniel Martinez and Poesía Chicana with Professor Lillian Gorman. When Highlands saw a mini resurgence of the Chicano activism of the 1970s, during the early 2000s, the old-timers told us about the murals activists had painted on campus during the Chicano movement. But that story had been covered up as part of the larger whitewashing, both literal and figurative, of student activists at Highlands. A new exhibition documents Chicano art and activism at NMHU in the 1970s. Voces del Pueblo, Artists of the Levantamiento Chicano in New Mexico, currently on view at the National Hispanic Cultural Center until February 8, 2026, documents the art and activism of 6 featured artists: Ignacio Nacho Jaramillo, Juanita J. Lavadí, Francisco Lefebvre, Noel Marquez, que descanse en paz, Roberta Marquez, and Adelita M. Medina, all of whom were students at NMHU in the 1970s. The exhibition was curated over 7 years by Ray Hernandez Duran, Dr. Ray Hernandez Duran, and Dr. Irene Vasquez, and contains 146 artworks by the 6 artists. Themes include community, family, querencia, land, home, and others. A focus of the exhibition is El Movimiento, the Chicano movement. In stark contrast to the colorful drawings, paintings, and tapestries created by her peers, Adelita M. Medina's black and white photographs help narrate the underlying story that the artists tell about the Chicano movement at Highlands. Her photography documents a multi-generational movement that occurred not only at the university but across the city. The roles that women and children played during the movement have been overshadowed by the stories of the men, and Medina's photos provide a window into the educational front of the Chicano movement in New Mexico. Most interestingly, her work provides a snapshot of the little-known alternative school for Chicano youth in Montezuma, just 5 miles north of Las Vegas. At the center of El Movimiento in Las Vegas was the demand for educational equity at the K-12 and college levels, and a culturally relevant curriculum to help students connect to their language, history, and cultural practices. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit about the school, which is Escuela Antonio José Martínez. Ooh, I can't see. On August 26, 1973, Chicanos Unidos para Justicia, CUPJ, took over one of the buildings at the Montezuma Castle, which had recently been a seminary for Mexican Jesuits until the Archdiocese of Santa Fe announced plans to sell the property in 1972. That day, about 100 people marched from the Plaza Vieja in Las Vegas after celebrating an outdoor mass there to the Montezuma Castle. CUPJ had been petitioning the Archdiocese of Santa Fe and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to rent the castle to start a school for Chicano youth. To no avail. After CUPJ occupied the building and refused to leave, the Archdiocese began to work with them. In a letter to the General Secretary of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Archbishop James Peter Davis states, after many meetings with those concerned, I am pleased to report that the Montezuma Seminary property problem has been thoroughly researched and the following conclusions are in order. The old buildings, including the castle, the former chapel building, and sufficient farm acreage to provide agricultural development for educational purposes and food supplies for the school, will be made available by grant of use to Chicanos Unidos para la Justicia. End quote. In this way, the Escuela Antonio José Martínez, named after Padre Martínez of northern New Mexico fame, was established. The CUPJ assigned Adelita M. Medina and David Montoya as coordinators for the escuela. While it was not accredited by the New Mexico State Department of Education, it did earn accreditation from the Rio Grande Educational Association, a regional accrediting agency for non-public schools. In January 1974, the New Mexico Supreme Court ruled that the state of New Mexico could not regulate non-public schools, which validated the RGEA accreditation. The school had approximately 75 students with instructors that included licensed teachers and professors from NMHU. According to co-curator Irene Vázquez, students from NMHU and community members organized the Escuela Padre Antonio José Martínez to provide youth with a culturally relevant, culturally inclusive education that centered the wisdom and resilience of their land-based communities. In one of Medina's photographs, Niños Sembrando en Montezuma, 1973, a dozen or so children lie in a bordo in an empty field and sow seeds, while one shirtless boy around 5 years old looks on. In Chicanitos at the Escuela Antonio José Martínez, 1973, a group of school kids pose in front of a fireplace for a class photo, but in this one, the kids all raise their arms in power fists, and one child opts for a peace sign. All the kids have smiles on their faces. So I'm just going to read the very end. In Rudolfo Naya's novel Heart of Aztlan, written during the Chicano movement but set in the 1950s, one of the characters says, I believe in revolution, like Lalo believes in revolution, but I think the revolution will be done by educating our children. Later, they will return to help us in their own way. They will return to work for our good. I trust in that. I too trust that university spaces have been and can continue to be revolutionary spaces where we will neither be punished nor made to kneel down and beg forgiveness for speaking Spanish or practicing our cultural values. And I just want to end by thanking Dr. Ray Hernandez Duran, Juanita J. Lavadi, Francisco Lefebvre, Adelita M. Medina, and Dr. Irene Vázquez for sharing their time and knowledge with me for this article. And we tried to get copies of Voces del Pueblo, the book, which is out from UNM Press. So please check that out. It is out as of December, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book. The closing reception for the exhibition is February 8th. And so maybe Ray can talk a little bit more about that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Myrriah. And for those of you who have a chance to go to the National Hispanic Cultural Center to see the show before it closes, I highly recommend it. It's huge. It's a big show. Adelita M Medina's photos are there, but there's the other 5 artists that Myrriah mentioned as well. And I also want to mention that Dr. Irena Vasquez is featured on the Encounter Culture podcast. I had a very interesting conversation with her a couple seasons back about La Llorona. So I highly recommend checking out that episode too. Okay, so we're going to move on to our last reader, Laura Paskus, who, as I mentioned, has 2 books back here for sale. She is a longtime environmental journalist, and I'm so excited that she agreed to write this article for me. Laura Paskus's article about bringing reading the wrong thing. You'll hear what the article is about. Laura Paskus is a longtime writer and producer based in Albuquerque and author of At the Precipice, New Mexico's Changing Climate, which is for sale back here. And also she edited Water Bodies, which features Santana and some other people in the audience. So welcome, Laura.
I won't touch the microphone. Thank you so much to Emily and Diffusion, and I can't tell you how thankful I feel to be a part of this panel today. I'm such a fan of the work that Rica does, and Santana is an amazing poet and friend, and Dr. Gomez, if you have not read her book, push each other out of the way to grab the copies that are up there. It's an incredibly important book for New Mexicans and beautifully written also. So anyway, sorry. So I wrote a piece for this issue about an excavation at the Pueblo of Acoma. And I'm just going to give you like a little bit of background on that. So for decades, the Pueblo of Acoma has wanted to build a bridge over the railroad tracks that separate the Pueblo and its villages from I-40. So as train traffic has increased and as trains have gotten longer and longer, there are these very long delays. And so oftentimes it's not just an inconvenience of people having to wait as you would for traffic or whatever. There have been instances where ambulances can't reach people, the fire department can't reach people, and it's a really serious issue. So for 5 decades, the Pueblo of Acoma has tried to get federal funding to build this bridge. And they just recently, in the last couple of years, have finally gotten funding, and they're moving forward with building this bridge. But before they can do that, there's a home site on a little finger ridge above the Rio San Jose. And so the Pueblo needs to excavate that home site before building the bridge. And so they contracted with the New Mexico Office of Archaeological Studies because they had worked with OAS in the past and had developed what they call sort of the Acoma method. I have some pretty strong opinions about archaeologists, in large part because I was one. I worked as an archaeologist and a tribal consultant in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I know firsthand how troubling that history is and the practice. And I will spare you my rants about tribal consultation. And I will just start reading. So I'm going to start reading sort of toward the end of the article, and I hope that you'll read the beginning. I don't feel as though my voice is the voice that should be reading that part, so I hope that you'll read what I learned from some people at the Pueblo of Acoma, including Stephen Concho and Raymond Concho, who I'm going to talk about. Okay. Traditionally, archaeologists were little more than looters and pot hunters. In the 19th century, the Southwest was full of white men who ripped apart sacred sites and ancient buildings and desecrated graves. Even in modern times, archaeologists and researchers have often treated human remains and funerary objects with curiosity rather than respect. People who had been laid carefully to rest in the earth to be with their ancestors were torn from the soil, measured and photographed, and placed in boxes upon shelves in hundreds of museums and storage facilities. There have been movements within the profession to work more closely with Native communities, and there are more Native archaeologists as well. But archaeology remains an extractive field of study. And while the Pueblo of Acoma can't control what archaeologists and researchers do on lands beyond their federally designated reservation, within their own boundaries, they choose to work with archaeologists who show greater respect for the past, the landscapes, and the living community. Working with archaeologists, I like making sure that they understand our story and where we're coming from, says Stephen Concho. He's the Pueblo of Acoma's Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Typically, Southwestern archaeologists were drawn to and valued masonry buildings, kivas, and other human-made sites, such as where someone napped a weapon or tool, cached a water pot, or ground and processed plants. What's important to us, says Stephen Concho, is not just a building, but it's everything that ties to it: the landscape, the trees, the water, the fields or plants, its relationship to the mountain, he said. Everything is connected to a site. And when I met with Stephen this summer, he recalled the words of Aaron Sims, who's also from the Pueblo of Acoma, who said, "One of the biggest issues that we constantly run into is the understanding of what is a cultural resource. For Acoma, all ancestral Pueblo archaeological resources are cultural resources, but not all cultural resources are archaeological in nature. All archaeologists should strive to understand and respect tribes, whether they're working on or off sovereign tribal lands. Doing work this way is sensible," says Dr. John Taylor Montoya. He's the executive director of the New Mexico Office of Archaeological Studies. Doing work this way bridges the gaps between scientific and traditional knowledge. It also is replicable across communities and archaeological companies. Why shouldn't we be doing this, he says? Why can't we have all of this work and do all of this work in concert to bring a full, rich story? Sometimes it's not intuitive. Sometimes the scientific data tells a different story than what the shared memory is, Taylor Montoya says. But we should respect and value what has been handed down through the generations from the people who witnessed those things. Archaeological work like this fosters understanding and empathy, he says, and brings knowledge together equitably. One of the cool things about archaeology is that it's not just studying big people and great events, says Taylor Montoya. It's everyday life. So you're talking about what you made for a meal, or how you cooked bread, and when you harvested corn. These are shared human experiences. At the now excavated site above the Rio San Jose on the Pueblo of Acoma, Raymond Concho, he's the director of community development at Acoma, and he's also Stephen's uncle. So at that now excavated home site above the Rio San Jose, Raymond Concho points across the valley to where he grew up and where Stephen's house is today. The past, the present, the future are all here, watched over by the mountain. Raymond recalls his childhood. He talks of an upcoming weekend celebration, and he sees the bridge where it will someday cross above the railroad tracks. All these stories, times, and places are connected. Meanwhile, no matter where they work, archaeologists, and all of us, can be better community members. The most important thing moving forward is archaeologists and tribes working together, says Stephen Concho. No matter what the project is, we have to work together. We don't own the land, we are stewards of the land, and our job is to protect it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And yes, please read the whole thing because there's so much more to all of these articles. So we're going to open it up to a Q&A now. What questions do you have, given that you only got little pieces of these articles? Do you have a question, Despa?
I was just curious, maybe it might be a conversation based on the last reading that we had. People asked, what was the purpose of El Palacio? And I noticed with the ending of Laura's article as to archaeology that there seems like there's like a kind of like a calling back to that. And I wanted to know if you could just very briefly explain that for some people here based on the last reading, and then a calling back to Laura's piece. I thought that was kind of brilliant, if you don't mind my saying.
You're testing my memory now. So last time there were some questions about El Palacio and what it does, what we cover, that kind of thing. And I believe it was David Correa. David Correa had some beautiful things to say that I'm not going to be able to say in the way he said them. But really, I see El Palacio as a place to tell the deeper histories of New Mexico. And, I think David said in so many words, we're not selling anything. This is about actually looking at what is here now, what the history is. Every time I edit an issue of El Palacio and I'm dealing with all these histories, they all feel so relevant to the present. I feel like everything that I cover in the magazine is still present in so many ways, or it's coming back in new forms. And so it feels like even when I'm covering history, that there's so much that we can take from it and apply to now. I don't think I'm answering your question though, but I would love all the contributors to talk about how they see El Palacio or their work in the context of El Palacio.
Well, you had mentioned that it was an archaeology pamphlet.
Pamphlet. Oh, right. Yes.
I like how the article
Right.
speaks to that.
True. Actually, yes. Thank you. I missed that. Yes, El Palacio started as an archaeological pamphlet. It was very thin. It was very small. It wasn't the magazine that it is today. And yes, there was a lot of looting and disrespectful things that were going on in the beginning that were reflected in the pages. You can look at the archive of El Palacio and see kind of its transformation over time as times changed with different editors. And so what it is today is very, very, very different. And yes, I love that Laura's article is kind of a bookend on that history now of where the magazine started. But yeah, I'd love to hear from all of you on your perspectives.
It was fun for me to work with Emily because I love Emily. But for me personally, it was really rewarding to work on this story. And, still, I wrote, archaeology is an extractive industry, so is journalism. And obviously, I am a white lady. And so it was important for me to be able to work on this piece and kind of work through some of my own distrust of archaeology and talk with people and friends at the Pueblo of Acoma, and to see, if you read the piece, what the Pueblo of Acoma is doing is they call it the Acoma method of archaeology, and it's really cool and it's really different from what traditional archaeologists do. And so, yeah, I think it's great to have awkward conversations with people and then try to convey what I learned to the public. So, yeah, and it was, Dr. Montoya was really kind in answering my questions as I was grappling with this and also what the state now does. So, yeah, it's to anybody else.
I don't know what we're talking about right now. I'm so sorry.
Just if you have any thoughts about El Palacio and what we do, what we cover. But you're free to pass the mic along.
I was telling a couple of people that it felt sort of weird to be reading this piece. And, you know, I love the way we're doing this, and we do the way that Emily's been doing these releases of the issues when there's like a whole new Latino movement going on outside, right? Against ICE, and thinking about like what was happening in the 1960s and 70s, what we now call the Chicano Movement, and like the movement we're in right now, and the way the themes that are present in this exhibition are still present in the world that we're living in terms of fighting ICE and thinking about how we're going to protect immigrants, Latinx immigrants in particular, Latinos. And that's something that I've really been thinking about leading up to this. The other thing that I guess I'll just say briefly is when Emily first asked me to write the article, the first person I contacted was my friend Francisco Lefebvre, whose work is featured in the exhibition. Francisco, wave your hand real quick. Whose sister was my third grade teacher in Poake. And we had a really amazing conversation where he really just relived that experience and told it to me. And then my friend Liana Torres from Tomé called me after she read the article and said, my dad spent the night there during the protest, and all these new articles, all these new stories came out. And sort of to come full circle, like, I was also thinking, you know, you and I were in a class that we just figured out. We had totally not even remembered that until recently. In 2016, when a lot of us were finding ways to become more involved in the activism that was going on against a fascist government at that time, I found myself sitting next to Miriam Langer, who's a professor at Highlands. Raise your hand, she's ducking. And it was the same thing. Like, we're sitting there next to each other, and before I knew it, it was like, oh, I know you. And she was faculty when I was a student. So I guess what I'm saying is that, like, all of these things are relevant. We relive and we relive and we relive. And, like, what students are out there on the streets right now that in 20, 30, 40 years are going to be, you know, faculty or whatever, putting together new shows of the activism and the art and the poetry that's happening right now. So I guess it's just like, pay attention to what's happening. I'm sure everybody, I don't want to assume, but probably my guess is the people in here are aware of what's going on. And so, yeah, I mean, this issue is, and for me to write this story right now is sort of important.
I also want to add that in this class that Myrriah and I were in at Highlands together, we read Borderland, right? Gloria Anzaldúa. So that connects. Do you have?
Yeah. I am not an academic or a journalist. I come to art writing as an artist and as a cultural worker. So, you know, it's like a slightly different frame of reference. But I have been really grateful for this particular opportunity and some of the other writing opportunities that I've had recently, because you know, there are we're surrounded by these extractive industries. Journalism is one of them, certainly. Cultural work is another one. You know, I worked for many years at an art museum that it was hard for me to separate that, like, oh, this is elaborate money laundering for people, from the art on view and from the kind of inherent value that is there. But I'm really glad that I've been able to make these connections with artists who have really important stories to tell. And, you know, I kind of piecing together Myrriah's words and Laura's words about returning and storytelling and these kind of generational movements to try to make this better world and critique institutions that have been disrespectful, have been damaging in so many ways. And it's interesting the way that artists are able to distill those narratives kind of all at the same time in an object or in an environment. And I like to think that some of that journalism about kind of getting those artist stories out and expressed for people who may not have seen the exhibition, or maybe they saw it and, you know, it didn't grab their focus or they got something else out of it, feels like an important, that feels like my role in a movement, is that I can tell those stories to a different audience and build those relationships with people who have a really interesting vision. And I'm glad that all of us are doing that in different ways, in kind of like cultural history and relationship building, and trying to keep those narratives alive, because that's hopefully a survival mechanism. My article's relatively bleak because I'm feeling relatively bleak at the moment, but it does feel like community and like the wisdom that all of us hold and can share is like a way forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
So I wanted to, per Dr. Gomez's request, I want to talk a little bit about the closing reception. But before I get to that, Laura, you made a comment that really resonated with me as an art historian when you speak of the distrust that you have as an archaeologist of archaeology. And I think any people with conscience, a people of conscience who work within these kinds of disciplines have the same kind of struggle. As an art historian, I work with a constant distrust of my field, given what really is a problematic, questionable historiography that in my case is veiled behind these lofty conversations of aesthetics and beauty. And you just kind of scratch the surface and there's some really ugly things in the history of how this discipline developed and how it's been implemented as a tool to elevate certain communities and denigrate others. You know, art history and Eurocentric concepts of art have a very insidious role in imperialism and colonialism when it came to the cultural production of other populations, in terms of the hierarchies that it reinforced, and then how those were used to validate or justify the treatment of different populations in terms of how advanced they were and intellectual, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to thank you for saying that, because it really speaks to how I approach my work. And I'm a trained colonialist. I'm a Spanish colonial expert, so typically if it's after 1850, I don't care. But I had the opportunity, I know a little bit, being Chicano, I mean, I know a little bit about my history and the movement. And when Irene invited me to work with her on this, I did a little research. And when I saw that there was like nothing written about specifically the Chicana and Chicano art movement here, I just saw an opportunity, you know, to contribute and help initiate a conversation that clearly needs to be had. I was really stunned when you said you grew up in Las Vegas and had never heard or knew anything about the movement. And this is precisely the issue, is that, as you mentioned, Myrriah, the whitewashing of the murals, it was a larger whitewashing of the entire movement. And the fact that members of this community don't know little to nothing about this movement is an issue that I'm hoping this exhibition begins to address. You know, as I've been saying, this exhibition is not the final word. It's meant to be the first step in what I hope will be a continued conversation. Other people could come in and work on the same artists and say completely different things. There are other artists in Las Vegas. There are the activists and the organizers, the educators. And this is just Las Vegas. What about Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Taos, all throughout the state? There's so much more work that needs to be done in terms of fleshing out sort of the history of the movement in the United States, which tends to center California. California really is the focus at the expense of all these other regions, not just in the Southwest, but what about our communities in the Midwest, for instance, or in the Northeast? We're all over the country, and the movement really unfolded everywhere, but we don't really hear about that. Southern California especially gets centered in this conversation. This is one of the things that I address in the catalog, which is the first scholarship on this. And as I tell people, if we miss something or get something wrong, then step up and write it. This is like a communal effort. We could only do so much in this catalog, but I'm hoping that people see it as a contribution, as something that attracts others to come and research and write and curate. So thank you, Myrriah. When you told me you were working on this, I was so excited because this is precisely the kind of thing I want to see. I want this exhibition to motivate further work. And of course, I'm so glad that you focused on Adelita's photographs and talked about the role of women and children, because in the movimiento, especially here in New Mexico, women were leaders. They're centered in the movement. The fact that women, you mentioned this in the article, and I know for time you didn't address this, but like the newspaper El Grito, that was run by women. So women play a very important role, and that's a topic within this larger conversation that needs more attention and more work. But to conclude, I don't want to hog the microphone, but the closing reception for the exhibition, which opened on April 25th in 2025, the closing's February 8th, which is a Sunday. It's from 2 to 4 at the Art Museum at the National Hispanic Cultural Center. It's free and open to the public. If y'all have been to the National Hispanic Cultural Center, their events are open and they're free, but they ask that you register online. It's free. That's how they keep track of how many people attend their events. I welcome everyone to come. All of the contributors, Irene, me, the contributors to the catalog, the artists will be there. UNM Press, which published the catalog, will have a representative, and you can buy copies of the catalog at the reception as well. So I hope to see some of you there. It should be a fun event to close what really has been a very successful exhibition and program. So thank you, and thank you, Myrriah.
In the interest of traveling management, will you tangentially, will you just circle back to what you said at the beginning about the excavation about to occur in Carmel? I believe I didn't quite digest it. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's the New Mexico State University is collaborating with the Land Grant Board of Cañón de Carnué. And so that's an ongoing excavation that's in progress now. But they're excavating the original site because there were two different sites. That land grant was established at two different times, and the first one was abandoned. So they are excavating that one. And my conversation with Kelly Jenks, who's at New Mexico State University, is going to be on the podcast and Counterculture this Wednesday. It's going to be coming out, so you can listen to everything that we talked about. Any other questions? I think we have time for one or two more, maybe.
Thank you, everyone, for your reading. My question is to Santana. We started with poetics, and I really appreciated that, especially times like this. Emma Goldman famously said, if your revolution doesn't have dance, I don't want a part of it. And if the revolution doesn't have poetics, I don't want a part of it, right? And so you said you were inspired by your student and literature, your mom's Prius, the alfalfa, all of those things. And I'm really interested in the ways that you can speak to kind of finding that grounding in poetics, especially in times like this.
Thanks, Joelle. I'm gonna pick on you guys with this one too, because I know you're all artists, so we're gonna pass the goodness and juiciness of this question around. When in the world gets dark, I stop looking at the news and I read more fiction. I don't think it's necessarily an escape, but I think it is that grounding that you talk about. And I think it is inspiration, and it gives me ideas for how I can live on a day-to-day, which ends up being what really matters when it's dark. And that comes through in poetry. I just got Ada Limon's new book of poetry called Startlement. And I find myself like grasping for more and more poetry right now, because it is the most sensical thing about everything that's happening. So I once I was a part of this summer program called Whitman on Walls that was put on by the Academy of Love and Learning in Santa Fe, and they did a series of interviews with the artists, and they brought in Manny Gonzalez, they brought in myself, they also brought in a theater group and also students from the World College, which was an interesting connection in this moment. And they did a bunch of interviews with us, and they asked me what they thought my responsibility was as an activist. And I was really taken aback by that question, because I don't think of myself as capital A activist. I think of myself as capital A artist. And being an activist actually, in my opinion, for me, requires a level of study and a level of education in that field. And when I say education, I don't mean you have to go to school for it, but like to study what it means to be in activism. And I haven't done that studying, but I have studied words a lot. And so my engagement personally in activism is via artistry, not as a formal activist, because I haven't studied that well enough to own that title for myself. And so I would just venture to anyone, in as you said with that beautiful quote, I do think being joyful is a form of resistance. I do think engaging in your art is a form of resistance, and humanity, that's the most connective tissue you can create between yourself and others who are very different or similar. So thank you for that question. You want to share?
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. Do you want first? Go for it.
I loved hearing, first of all, I fell in love with Santana's work when it was the very end piece of an issue that I had, a different issue that I had a story in, an article in. Desba also had a piece in there, beautiful piece. And I got to the end and I was like, who is Santana Shorty? And now I'm like a bigger fan over here. You're just brilliant, Santana. Similarly, I always say I'm not an activist. I'm not an activist with a capital A. Academic is my capital A. So it was interesting hearing you say that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there though, because yeah.
I don't have a ton of information on this. This is just one of those like little blips of information that like made its way into my head without me reading like the full article. So take it with a grain of salt. But I've seen recently that like AI can be combated with poetry. Like it doesn't understand, which makes sense. It can't parse it, and then you can kind of manipulate AI through poetry, which I was like, wow, that is so, feels so right. And I have to a little bit hold on to art making at this time as a way of maybe divining a tool that hasn't been used, or tapping into kind of some collective unconscious to find a medium for a message that might resonate, you know. And it's hard to tell in just like one human lifespan, or even just, you know, we're forced by capitalism to think in like quarters or years or like business days. It's hard to tell what is going to latch on and what is going to have an impact in those spans of time. But we can see from history and from archaeology, and from the people who do like take the critical care to like tell the stories from all over the world, from all over time, that like there are things that make their way through and make an impact. So, and a lot of them are art, because a lot of them are like some kind of abstracted creation or way of conveying meaning outside of your traditional, I'm going to sit down and tell you a thing. So yeah, that's hopefully art is a tool. I like to think that it is or could be. And I'm thinking art as like the huge overarching umbrella that would encompass like written art, visual art, performing art, activism in some ways, because I am also not capital A activist, but I do study activism historically and like the choreography of it, because I'm a socially engaged practitioner. So I'm interested in how activism works, if that makes sense. So I'm rambling at this point, but art's a tool. Art's a tool for the revolution.
Like Santana, I find myself these days, I just want to read fiction and poetry. And it's not because I'm shutting out the world, but because I am seeking the knowledge of people who tell stories and translate the world in ways that are manageable, because the world feels pretty unmanageable right now. And so most of the writing that I do is not at all about archaeology. It's about water and climate change. And for me, I've spent a couple of decades like writing out the facts of a changing world and environmental disasters, and the facts don't feel like they connect people to the real world necessarily. It's good to know those facts, but for me, the transition that I've made in my writing in the last few years is really basically to experience a thing, write a terrible poem that I would never share with anyone, and use those poems and pieces within my news reporting to try to connect with people. So like, just for example, I had a piece about climate change in Source, New Mexico last week, and a careful reader would be able to find where the crappy poems are in there in prose form now. Challenge accepted. But I think like water bodies, and like I asked contributors like Santana and Leanna, these big things are happening, and there are ways to tell stories that we connect with one another and draw new stories out of readers rather than just telling readers what's happening. So that's how I try to engage with art and hope and optimism and community.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you all. And thank you all for coming. We have so many more cookies and lemonade back there, so please go take them so we don't have to take them home with us. And then please look at the books and the magazines, and thank you so much for coming.